Hello and welcome back to McClaren Performance for an episode today where I want to talk about what a sports psychologist actually does at a football club. There's a lot of talk about psychology with little understanding about what it actually does, and I want to clear some of that up today. A big part of why I wanted to make this episode is because I've just become qualified as a sport and exercise psychologist, whereas before I was technically really a trainee. And what better way to celebrate it than talk about what my job actually is. Sports psychology is a really funny topic because you have a lot of jobs in football clubs that are quite clear, quite obvious what they are. For example, physios, coaches. You don't really need a video describing what they do. It's quite straightforward. But sports psychology really, especially in football, isn't really that well defined. It's not really that well structured. So you wouldn't find a sports psychologist working in one club doing exactly the same thing as one of the sports psychologists doing in another. Some clubs won't even have a sports psychologist. For example, Tottenham don't have a sports psychologist at the moment. They've advertised for one, but as far as I'm aware, I don't think they actually do have one. Some clubs will have people that will do the work of a sports psychologist, but won't actually be a sports psychologist. So you'd have someone, for example, like Lee Richardson. He works at Liverpool. He calls himself a performance psychologist, and from that, I gather he probably doesn't have the full qualification of a sports psychologist. To be honest though, at the moment, looking at, say, that all the Premier League teams, all the first teams within those clubs, I doubt they will have a sport psychologist in each of those teams fully working in and amongst the coaching staff. But there are some still that seem to use sports psychologists, or at least people that do the job of a sports psychologist. For example, Brighton and Brentford. It's not a coincidence that they're two teams that are performing quite well at the moment. Both of those teams utilise sports psychology really well. Brighton, for one, have a team of psychologists, being either clinical or performance psychologists. With that, they have mental well-being experts as well. Brentford employ a sport or performance psychologist, not quite clear. A guy called Michael Caulfield. He works part-time at the club and he does a number of things with the team. And like I said, across those clubs, the work that the sports psychologists do within there will vary quite a lot with regards to how much contact they have with the coaching staff, with the players. The sports psychologist's main one responsibility, though, it will be consistent throughout all the clubs, is that a person will be there to talk to a player if a player wants to talk to them. That won't be mandatory for a player to talk to a sports psychologist, but if they wanted that help, then the sports psychologist is there to help. And that conversation would quite simply be a conversation. A player might struggle in a certain area of the game. They might have problems with the way they're thinking, how they turn up to the game. They might struggle dealing with pressure. They may lack confidence, anything like that. And it will involve a conversation to figure that out. Or it might be suggesting and implementing some things like self-talk, like imagery, like breathing techniques, tools really that can help a player deal with certain things. Again, why it's so hard to pin down sports psychology in football is because a lot of players now employ sports psychologists outside the club. They'll have someone to talk to really that isn't associated with the club at all. In any case, really, it's good sports psychologists. They're a good sounding board for a player to talk about their problems, and for a psychologist to delve deeper into that and find solutions for it. Along with the sports psychologists having that responsibility for individual players, they also have a responsibility for the culture and the environment of the team, the interaction of people, and with that, they'll probably talk and advise with managers, with staff, with coaches, just to keep a finger on the pulse of things that are going on. For example, I work with Newcastle women's football team, and when I do that, a lot of my time is spent being there, walking around, talking to people, getting an idea of things, and advising a lot to the manager and the coaches and the players. My work also involves that one-on-one conversation with the players as well, and I do that also, but I think the biggest thing a sports psychologist can do within a club is be that someone who takes care of the culture, the environment, make sure everything's well, and if it's not, try and find solutions and be a middle ground for people. Another thing a sports psychologist might do within a club is implement psychometric testing, and what that basically is a test or a questionnaire which would bring out data for a player with regards to their personality in different areas. A lot of clubs like this because it gives solid, objective data and information on players, which they can then use when it comes to coaching and talking to them. When I talked to and went to see the sports psychologist that worked at Derby just about a year ago, one thing they like to do at Derby is use Spotlight. Spotlight is a personality measure test, which just for every individual player out, I think 4 characteristics, spotlight certain areas in which they kind of fit with. Football clubs really like that objective information that come from psychometric testing. And another thing they really like, and I think it's become a lot more popular in clubs, is the use of neuroscience, which is where I think you've probably seen it, where people have scanners on their brains and it gives an image, shows brain activity in certain areas when players are doing things on the pitch. Liverpool have quite recently worked with a company that do just that, measure the brain activity of players when they're taking penalties and free kicks, and then utilize that to teach the players really what they should be thinking and doing during these things to get the best out of themselves. I went to a conference the other day where a woman who worked for Sheffield United, who isn't quite a sports psychologist, more of a neuroscientist, who does exactly that really in Sheffield United, who measures brain activity, but also acts a lot as a sports psychologist while talking to players, talking to coaches. Honestly, sports psychology is so experimental at the moment that anything could really be happening in lots of different clubs. For example, Chelsea just a few years ago did something which was psychologically coded football games, where someone would watch the game and then tick down areas and points where players did something that showed confidence or anything else. And then from that could have a measure of different psychological traits of players within the game. I saw a paper as well from a sports psychologist who at least worked in the Premier League recently, who said he did a lot of work around goal setting, doing action plans for players as well. So writing down exactly what they want to do, building from short-term goals to long-term goals, that sort of thing. Actually, quite recently, Gary Neville and Jamie Carragher were talking on Monday Night Football, talking about Harry Maguire and things like psychology. And they spoke quite well about what sports psychology is and how they used it just for having a conversation with someone to learn certain triggers and things they could do to deal with situations and really put all the thoughts into their head into a different context with it bouncing off somebody else. Right now, sports psychology is utilised a lot more, say, in academies than it is in the first team itself. With the whole kind of the politics of things, it's really difficult for a lot of sports psychologists to get into football. You can get in with regards to an academy, you can apply for a job within an academy and do things like that, but to work in actual first team with first team players, it's really important you have a relationship with the manager. And what you find is that managers coming in know a sports psychologist or know someone who is a performance coach and will bring them in to help them with the first team. So it's usually someone that the manager trusts quite a lot. That's what my dad did when he was a manager. Say at Middlesbrough, he worked with Bill Bezic, who was a performance psychologist. When he went to Newcastle, he worked with someone called Steve Black, who was a performance coach, let's say. So it was always a personal relationship that he had with someone else to bring them in. It's rarely a job that is consistently staying within the first team, regardless of what manager is coming in or out. If you don't have that relationship with the manager, as a sports psychologist, as anything really, you are not going to be doing much within the team. You're not going to be doing much to help the players. And it's why for a lot of sports psychologists, it's a bit of a nightmare implementing what you want to implement. It's also difficult because it's the one job I think that bleeds over so much into a coaching role, where you're talking and really coaching the players, not on the specifics of football, but on the general aspect of performance and being an athlete and everything like that. So it's very hard to maintain a relationship with coaches, with managers, everything like that, because you're often stepping on the toes of those people and doing their job and kind of looking like a bit of a nerd doing it because you're coming from a lot of theory and things like that. I hope that clears up a bit what a sports psychologist is and what they do. There's a lot of different things really, and it's never a specific role with a specific this is what you do. It's usually creative amongst the sports psychologists to say, right, what do I want to do in this environment? What can I get away with doing? But yeah, thank you for watching and listening. I hope that was informative in some way. I tried to give as much away as I could and explain it as best as I can, but it's also quite a complicated job and it changes day in, day out really. Let me know your thoughts, like and subscribe as well if you haven't, leave a review on the audio podcast as well if you could, and I will see you again next week.